The biggest thing that I hope for is that this conference is going to deliver a clear roadmap in terms of how to come to a broad climate change agreement in 2015. There was a mandate provided a couple of years ago in Durban to come to an international approach to climate change that would embrace all countries. That approach has to be agreed in 2015, and this conference needs to set out the negotiating roadmap that is going to make sure that we get to that goal in time. That, I think, is the most important thing that this conference needs to deliver. But it can only deliver that if it delivers a number of other things as well. And one of the most significant other things that it needs to deliver is more confidence for developing countries on where debates around finance are going to go, both short-term finance up to 2020 and longer-term finance beyond that.
Having said that, do you think it's going backwards from Durban because of arguments around historical responsibility and loss and damage?
The issue of loss and damage has been around in this process for about 20 years, and that's logical because since greenhouse gases stay up there for such a long time, it is important to know who's caused them, who's put them up there, and who is historically responsible. How you then go and allocate historical responsibility to different countries over things that have been done many generations ago is a lot more difficult, which is why you see the struggle here. Another reason why you see the struggle here is because potentially it can become very expensive if you really have to compensate developing countries for all the damage that they're incurring. So that is proving to be a very emotional debate. I think that began right at the opening with the Philippine delegates going on hunger strike because of what had just happened in the Philippines around an environmental disaster. So that has led to some very high emotions and high tension.
You mentioned at the start that this is a roadmap to 2015 where countries are going to have to put targets on the table to cut carbon emissions. Japan and Australia have both reduced their own targets. Are you confident that we will get a deal in 2015 that does reduce targets enough to reduce emissions to keep temperatures below 2°C?
Nope, I don't think that's going to happen. Even in my most optimistic scenario, that's not going to happen, because to agree targets that would avoid the 2-degree temperature increase in one fell swoop would require enormous emission reductions, especially from industrialized countries. And I don't think that industrialized countries that are hopefully coming out of an economic crisis are willing to commit to all of that in one go. So I think a successful conference in 2015 is all about setting a significant step towards limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees and then saying, right, we're going to meet again in 3 years or 4 years' time, see what the shortfall is, and have additional pledges to make up the difference.
Interesting. Do you think that you were in this position 2 years before Copenhagen, how does it differ? I think it was Bali, in fact, wasn't it? No, Poznan. It was another Polish COP. How does this one feel? Does it feel like it's going towards a success or towards something a bit more different like Copenhagen?
There have been three mandates in the history of this process. The first mandate was given at the first Conference of Parties in Berlin. It was called the Berlin Mandate. And that was a very clear mandate. It basically said, go away, negotiate a protocol, which is only about targets for industrialized countries, finish the work in 2 years' time. So that was a very clear mandate, and 2 years later, in Kyoto, the protocol was signed. The second mandate that we had was the Bali Mandate in 2007, which produced a wonderful roadmap, a wonderful action plan, but it said that that was supposed to lead to an agreed outcome 2 years later in Copenhagen. And an agreed outcome meant many different things to many different people. That formulation was chosen to close the conference successfully, to push the difficult issues forward. And that, I think, in a way was a mistake, because what you saw in Copenhagen was many people with many different expectations in terms of what an agreed outcome was supposed to be. Now we're working with the third mandate, which is the Durban Mandate. And that's sort of in between Berlin and Bali, in the sense that it talks about either a treaty or a protocol or decisions with legal force. But that still leaves a lot of unclarity around the legal question. So I think one of the important things to resolve as early as possible is what exactly a country is going to be agreeing to in 2015. is that international legally binding targets, or are those targets that they write international law? Is there going to be room for different kinds of targets? Those, I think, are some of the questions that need to be resolved early on for people to really feel comfortable and negotiate.
I think most people's understanding that in Paris is that we will have a legally binding target with targets on the table. Are you saying that you don't think that will happen and instead it will be another agreement agreeing to that in 2 or 3 years' time?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I think what would make a lot of sense is to have a treaty or a protocol in 2015 that in that treaty you record all of the commitments that countries have made, different commitments for different countries, and that those countries then have the obligation to translate that commitment into national law. So I think write the commitment into the treaty, but then have the obligation to write it into national law. I think that that would be legally much stronger than this vague notion of international legally binding. When Canada decided to leave the Kyoto Protocol, there were no consequences. So I think international legally binding is, first of all, very difficult to enforce, and secondly, completely unpalatable to the United States, probably to China, and to a number of others. So I think by going for an undefined concept of international legally binding, you might actually be making things a lot more complicated without offering a real solution. And I think if you record the targets in a treaty, so everyone's accountable, and you oblige them to turn it into national law, that might actually be stronger.
Okay. What about business? You said that you don't think that the targets being talked about are going to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees. Is there a chance that we could still cut emissions if you do it through other means, i.e. through business?
Well, any target that's approved is going to be implemented by business. Government will create the policy framework that then drives business change in a certain direction, up, down, or to continue where we are. So at the end of the day, most of the solutions are delivered by the business community. And I mean, if I talk to CEOs, which is now my sort of day job, and I ask them, what do you want most? They don't actually say money, they don't say tax breaks. What they say is long-term predictability. We want to know where governments are going in the long term. Because if you're building a steel factory or a power plant today, that's going to be around for 30 to 50 years. So you want to know what kind of policy environment that plant is going to be operating in 20, 30 years' time. And what you actually see is that the thing that most politicians are worst at is providing long-term predictability. Spain has reversed feed-in tariffs. Laws in lots of countries have changed, and investments have been lost because of that. And that, I think, is why an international treaty is so important, because that can give you confidence over the longer term.
What about the coal involvement in coal in this summit? It's obviously been sponsored by a lot of coal companies. There was a coal summit. Do you think that that's taking the talks backwards as well? Poland has made clear its resistance to Europe moving towards a 30% target in 2020. Do you think that coal has a future in these talks, or should they just shut down?
I think that for the time being, coal is an inevitable part of the energy mix, because countries like Poland, like China, like India, even like South Africa have an abundance of coal. It's a very cheap energy source for them, and they want to use it. So the thing we need to do there, I think, is to push carbon prices in such a direction that you either develop affordable technologies to cope with coal, for example, carbon capture and storage, or that the price of CO2 becomes so high that wind, solar, tidal energy, hydro are much more attractive financially than coal, and the coal basically stays in the ground because there are alternatives. I mean, we didn't make the transition from stone arrowheads to bronze arrowheads because the stones were finished, but because we'd found something better, and I could see that happening again.
Last night, I understand that a group, I think it was China, walked out the G77 talks because of loss and damage. Do you think this issue might stop the talks progressing?
I think it might. I mean, as I said earlier on, this conference started off very emotionally with the Philippine head of delegation going on hunger strike because of an extreme weather event that many people associate with climate change, a climate change that's been caused by rich countries. So there is a very emotional, strong emotional sense in the room, in the conference center, that rich countries should be paying for the damage that they've caused and that they're still causing. So that, I think, is a very strong emotional issue. It's a very strong political issue, but it's also a very strong economic issue. And my feeling is that if industrialized countries don't respond to those concerns properly, that could very well derail the talks here.
I think then the only way forward is a compromise. How do you see that compromise panning out on loss and damage?
If I had the answer to that question, we'd be completely out of trouble. I think, as with most compromises, the thing is to find middle ground. I think a lot more can be done to help developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change, and that, for example, can be done through the Green Climate Fund, which is also being debated here. Probably the even more important challenge is how to make developing countries resilient in terms of being able to cope with future impacts of climate change. And there, I think it's a question of helping countries to shape mitigation and adaptation strategies in such a way that they are not only able to cope with the risks of today, but also with the risks of tomorrow. And I think there is definitely a responsibility for rich nations to reach out to the poor to help make that happen.
Do you think it might be a distraction having another track of talks, another subject, loss and damage, when in fact adaptation is already talked about?
Well, I think the issue of loss and damage is important to so many countries that you need to give it a good place on the agenda. I mean, if you care really, really strongly about something and a chairperson tells you that your big concern is going to be muffled away under some other agenda item, that's not really going to satisfy you. So I think the issue needs to be given the attention that it deserves.
In Bali, you famously broke down in tears because it got so frustrating. Do you ever feel like crying again when you watch these negotiations?
Well, I must say that I've personally been involved in the climate process since 1994, when the first conference of parties happened at the end of that year. And we just seem to go on and on and on with negotiations every year, attended by more and more people, crafting roadmaps on top of roadmaps. And I wish we'd finally go somewhere instead of making more roadmaps.